In Magic, there are currently 9 card types. Each of these card types has specific rules baggage associated with it, but more importantly, they all have their own competitive histories. Some of these card types have better than others. And today, we're going to rank all of the card types in terms of power level. To be clear, we're talking about how good the card type is in all formats, averaging their power level in every format together, so every format should be represented. To start us off at number 9, we have Tribal. This is the strangest card type in the game and one that Wizards doesn't really use anymore. Tribal was created for a very specific purpose. Wizards wanted to give creature tribal decks more support. To do this, they decided to give creature types to cards that aren't creatures. For complicated rules reasons, the easiest way to have non-creature cards with creature types was to invent a new card type that shared all of the subtypes with creatures. This is where Tribal comes in, with cards like All Is Dust not only being sorceries, but also being tribal spells with creature types, in this case Eldrazi. Now, there's nothing inherent to this approach to design that makes it a worse card type in the game. The issue is more how it was used and why the card type was ultimately dropped. We've made an entire video on this subject already, so we'll keep this brief. Basically, tribal cards were usually slightly weaker versions of effects that shared a creature type for certain synergies. For example, Tarfire has the Goblin creature type. This means that when Goblin Matrone says you can add any Goblin card from your library to your hand, it can grab Tarfire. Or if you have a Bitter Blossom on the battlefield, cards like Spellstutter Sprite will count it towards their ability. However, having the cards be worse overall meant that, outside of a few outliers, the cards wouldn't see any play outside of tribal decks. Additionally, the cards needed a lot of other cards referring to their creature types for the text to matter at all. One of the most successful tribal cards, the aforementioned All Is Dust, has the Eldrazi card type, which almost never matters in the decks that play it. On top of that, there was also the flavor issue. As it quickly became apparent, there wasn't a great way to decide what cards should or shouldn't be included as tribal cards. There were only 55 tribal cards total, the second lowest of any card type, and the cards being tribal have had almost no impact on them seeing play. The main reason this type ranks so low on this list, beyond there being not that many important cards of the type, is because cards having this type almost never matters. And at number 8, we have Battle. This is a very strange card type with far more rules baggage than other card types. The way Battle works is that as they enter the battlefield, you choose an opponent to protect it. You and your opponent can attack it, and that opponent can block those creatures. Any damage dealt to it will remove that many defense counters from the card. When the last one is removed, you exile the card, then you can cast it transformed by paying its mana cost. This is the newest card type added to the game, and the first time that a new card type has been added to the game in nearly a decade. As a result, this is the least common card type in the entire game, with there only being 36 battles in the entire game. This does hold the card type back quite a bit, as it simply hasn't had the opportunity to have powerful cards for it printed. While all the battles do have effects when they come into play, these effects have to be made worse to compensate for the powerful backsides of the battles. As a result, the battles have had a much more difficult time breaking into older formats. Additionally, there's the issue that in order to get the full value off the card, you have to attack them with a creature several times. While this isn't a huge ask, it does mean that the cards are a lot worse in creature-light decks, which are more common in older, more powerful formats. Even if a battle had a great backside that you wanted to take advantage of in a combo deck, it wouldn't be viable in formats like Modern just because flipping it would be too difficult. Cards like Cadis, Sea Tyrant of Segovia have very powerful abilities that can put in a lot of work, but you can't build towards it as a combo win condition thanks to these restrictions. This isn't to say that none of the battles have been successful outside of Standard though. Cards like Invasion of Ixalan and Invasion of Gobakhan have been seeing quite a bit of play in formats like Pioneer, but none of them have really broken into any more powerful formats. It's very uncertain if we'll ever see any more battles in the future, so they might not get the chance to improve their position on this list. And at number 7, we have Enchantments. Enchantments are one of the original card types introduced in the very first set of Magic, though the way they've worked has changed over the years, as have many other card types. However, there are a few aspects of enchantments that have remained mostly the same. Enchantments are permanents that can have a wide variety of abilities, but they very rarely have tap abilities. There's no way to interact with enchantments inherently, unlike battles, so the only way to get rid of an enchantment is to use a specific removal spell. Outside of these normal enchantments, there's a very common subtype of enchantment in auras. These are cards that would be attached to a permanent, or in some cases, a player, and would do something that interacts with that object in some way. If that object leaves the field, auras are automatically placed into the graveyard. This makes auras a famously bad card type, as a single removal spell can answer several cards from your opponent if they put all of their auras into a single creature, or just get a 2-for-1 in the most likely case. While auras in specific are fairly weak, that doesn't necessarily drag down the entire card type. Rather, enchantments end up here thanks to being overall a weak card type without too many synergies or ways of making them more powerful. Enchantments are one of the rarest card types in the game, and there were a few reasons for that. Beyond not having too many synergies to make them better, as we just said, it also doesn't have an impact on the board the turn you cast the spells, not unless they happen to have incredibly powerful abilities. For example, a card like Black Market has a potentially powerful ability, adding a ton of black mana during each of your turns, but requires a bunch of creatures to die in order to build up. This is a trait shared by a lot of enchantments. They don't do anything by themselves and require help to get going. In competitive formats, this makes them far riskier to play than compared to cards with more upfront value. There's a reason why Serra Sanctum, a card that has a nearly identical effect to Gaia's Cradle and Tolarian Academy, is the overall weakest of the bunch. Each of these cards can be tapped for 1 mana of a particular color for each card of a single type, and enchantments are the worst ones to try and spam the board with. While enchantments have had a history competitive play, they've generally been less impactful and powerful than every other common card type. And at number 6, we have Planeswalker. This is one of the more complex card types in the game and one of the newest. These are cards that can be attacked like a player, coming in with a certain amount of loyalty, similar to battles. However, they enter the battlefield on your side of the field and you have to protect them. In addition, once per turn at sorcery speed, you can activate one of the card's loyalty abilities. Each of these abilities will either add, subtract, or rarely not, change the Planeswalker's loyalty in exchange for one of several abilities. The plus abilities are the weakest, as they add loyalty to the Planeswalker, making it more difficult to remove and letting you activate the minus abilities of the Planeswalkers more. The minus abilities are more powerful, but make the Planeswalker weaker, and you can't use them unless you have enough loyalty in the first place. Planeswalkers are extremely powerful cards that have a number of built-in downsides to make them more fair, leaving them in a very strange spot as far as power levels go. Most Planeswalkers can and will take over a game if left alone for a long enough time. For example, Ob Nixilis Reignited can draw you cards, destroy creatures, and give your opponent an emblem whenever any player draws a card, they lose 2 life. If you're able to give them this emblem, you'll eventually win the game just by not dying for long enough. Even if you can't pull that off, the amount of advantage the card can give you in drawing multiple cards and removing multiple creatures can make it almost impossible for your opponent to come back. However, this is all balanced out by the fact that Ob Nixilis and other Planeswalkers can be attacked and killed, which means you can lose out on an entire card without your opponent wasting a removal spell. This balance of power leaves Planeswalkers in a weird spot, where they can be incredibly powerful, but can be very weak at the same time. This is made even more difficult to evaluate by how rare the card type is. Most sets only have about 3 Planeswalkers in them, meaning that there's only 3 cards that have a chance to have an impact on the metagame every set, as opposed to the dozens of every other card type. This rarity is the main thing holding the card type back. While on average, Planeswalkers are a fairly powerful card type, their overall impact on the game is low thanks to just how few of them there are. This leaves them as one of the weakest card types in the game, mostly by default. And at number 5, we have Land. Lands are, of course, how you produce mana to cast your spells. Once per turn, you can play 1 land during your turn. The vast majority of lands can be tapped for 1 mana once each turn, and often have some other abilities that can make them more powerful. This makes lands one of the most difficult to evaluate card types in the game. In some sense, they're the most powerful cards in the game, as they allow you to cast all of your other spells. In another sense, they're some of the weakest, as a deck full of nothing but lands can't actually do much of anything. As a result, they've landed smack dab in the middle of the list, balancing both of these approaches to the power level of the card. Most of the best lands are just lands that are really good at producing mana. For example, cards like Shock lands are powerful thanks to producing 2 colors of mana for a very low cost. And cards like Ancient Tomb are powerful thanks to producing more than 1 mana at a time. However, in older formats, there are lands with unique abilities that can accomplish very powerful and different things. One very important land in Legacy is Wasteland, a land which is primarily used to destroy other non-basic lands. This mostly functions to punish multicolored decks by turning off certain colors, or to destroy other important land cards. For example, Dark Depths is the centerpiece of a land-based combo deck thanks to being able to produce a 20/20 indestructible flying creature token. Another notable land is their Tabernacle of Pendrell Vale, which gives all creatures the ability where they destroy themselves during their controller's upkeep unless they pay 1 mana. All of these lands together have allowed for land-focused decks in Legacy, though this isn't viable in any other format. This is why the card type is only in the middle of this list, as it hasn't had a big impact on any other formats besides Legacy and Vintage, outside of simply producing mana. So while there are very powerful lands, they're confined to a small portion of the ways to play Magic. And at number 4, we have Sorcery. This is one of only 2 non-permanent card types. Instead, these spells have an effect that happens when they resolve, and then they're put directly into the graveyard. Sorceries can only be cast whenever other spells can be cast during your main phase while the stack is empty, unlike its sister card type Instants. To make up for this, they have even more powerful effects. Sorceries have the biggest impact on the board when they're cast of any card type in the game. Some of the most powerful effects in the game are most often put on sorceries, such as board wipes and draw spells. If you want the board state to change in a big way as soon as possible, sorceries are the way to go. In exchange for their upfront power, sorceries can stick around and continue to have an impact on the game. As a result, there are few decks built with only sorceries and instants. However, most decks will use at least some sorceries or instants if they happen to be better for the job. The ability to draw more cards, easily remove threats, or do other powerful things like cheat out threats or deal direct damage can help supplement your strategy. Due to how powerful these effects are, sorcery/instants are often meta-defining cards. Aggro decks are defined by what the best board wipes and removal are, and what threats are best against them. Control decks are often defined not only by these cards, but by what the best way to refill their hands are. Sorceries are so important that it's basically impossible to build a deck without them. But there are some other card types that are even more meta-defining, such as, and at number 3 in this list, we have creatures. These are, well, creatures. They permanently stick on the board, can attack and block, and are the building blocks of the entire game. Everything in Magic is based around, at some level, creature combat and how to deal with it. When we alluded to card types not affecting the board earlier, what that means is they don't affect creatures in any meaningful way on their own. As the building block of the game, it makes sense that creatures are one of the most powerful card types around. However, there are a couple of asterisks to that statement, mainly that creatures' power level is very dependent on the meta. While the game is designed around creatures, there are times when decks have better win conditions in attacking their opponent, especially in the earlier days of Magic and in older, more powerful formats. Combo decks are very strong in formats like Vintage and Legacy, though that's not to say that creature decks don't see any play there. In the early days of Magic, creatures were severely underpowered. There was a time when Grizzly Bears was considered a playable card, which is unthinkable in the modern day. However, in formats like Standard or Pioneer, creatures are very important, and it wouldn't be that difficult to argue that they're the most powerful card type in those formats. This makes creatures one of the most inconsistently powerful card types, with them being the most important card type in some metas and almost being irrelevant in others. However, even at their worst, creatures are still quite playable, easily putting them in the top echelons of card types. While not the most powerful card type around, they are the bar. Every action in a game of Magic is usually compared to simply playing another creature, evaluated based on how much better or worse developing your board would be. Despite this, there are 2 card types that just barely edge out creatures in terms of how powerful they are. And at number 2, we have instants. Instants are sorceries that can be cast at any time. It's a bit strange to see this card type not only above sorceries, a card type they're very similar to, but also above creatures, which is what sorceries were ranked below. The reason for this is that being able to do things at instant speed is simply so important that it shapes the rest of the way the game is played, especially in older, more powerful formats. While sorceries are often meta-defining in terms of what they can do, instants are even more so thanks to being so much more flexible. Players will often play cards with weaker effects just because they can be cast at instant speed, allowing you to have much more agency over the way the game plays out. The best removal spell, draw spell, and counter spell in any format will define a lot of how players play the game and how they build their decks, and more often than not, these are instants rather than sorceries. The only effects that are consistently found on sorceries rather than instants that are often very meta-defining are board wipes. But these are only really found in control decks, and in older formats, control decks might not even play these cards. In Modern, the only deck that consistently mainboards board wipes is Control, which hasn't been a tier 1 deck in years. In Legacy and Vintage, board wipes are almost never played as the formats are simply too fast for decks to put out multiple creatures. Instead, single target removal is much better, and the best single target removal is almost always instant. The reason the instant ekes out over creatures is due to how much more important they are in older formats. While creatures are slightly better than instants in weaker formats, instants are notably better in more powerful formats, giving them a slight edge. Despite all their power, there's one card type that's even better, if only slightly. And all the way at number 1, we have artifacts. This card type is almost the same as enchantments, except they have tap abilities far more often. It may seem strange that it's ended up so much higher than enchantments did, but there are a few reasons for that. First off, artifacts have more zero-cost spells than any other card type, and it's not particularly close. This means that spamming the board with a lot of artifacts is by far the easiest of any card type. It's not uncommon to see players who built decks designed to spam out artifacts this way play most of, if not all of their hands out in a single turn. Outside of how spammable the card type is, it also has the most powerful synergies of any type. Mechanics like Affinity and Improvise are both powerful abilities that have allowed these cards to see play in various formats, and at times has been a huge problem for the game. Affinity famously almost killed the game when it was first printed into Standard, and even though Blizzard has found a way to fix the mechanic since, it took them a long time before they tried again. However, more than anything, the reason that Artifact is so high on this list is that some of the most powerful cards ever printed are artifacts, and this design mistake has allowed the card type to remain incredibly powerful for decades. In the first set, 6 of the 9 members of the Power 9 were artifacts. The Moxen and Black Lotus were some of the most overpowered cards ever printed, and even nerfed versions of the cards, such as Chrome Mox and Lotus Petal, have still had a huge impact on the game after being printed. Even Mox Amber, one of the most heavily nerfed versions of the mechanic, was still a central piece of a combo deck in its Standard. These overtuned artifacts have made artifact-based decks a terror in Vintage, Legacy, and Modern ever since the earliest days of the game. While the card type is generally about as strong as enchantments, in basically every non-rotating format, overpowered artifacts have played a role in the metagame. Artifacts are in a very weird place in the game, where, while the average artifacts aren't really that great, the highs of the card type are staggering, far more than any other card type they can compare to. The heights are so high that if you were to simply average them out with the lows, it would still end up on top, earning it the title of the most powerful card type in the game. And that's the list. Do you have any ideas for future videos just like this one? If so, please let us know down in the comments below.